everybody, welcome to the Village Guy. Of course, if you're joining for the first time, this is a show where we chat to people of Paarl and Wellington doing amazing things. But today it's a bit different. We have crossed paths with an individual that is an historian and a curator and a researcher, and her name is Tracey Randle. And she's just got this cool collection of photos of Paarl and Franschhoek, just very good quality photos. I wanted to find out more about her. I wanted to find out more about the collection she had. Of course, those that know a bit of history of Paarl, it's called the Gribble Collection. And I wanted to find out more about it. Welcome, Tracey.
Thank you so much for having me, and it's wonderful to be here and chatting to all your wonderful supporters and community.
So why are we an historian and a researcher and a curator?
Probably questions my parents ask as well, but I think the South African history and Cape history especially has always been fascinating to me. Since I studied at UCT, history and archaeology and anthropology, and spent my honours thesis looking at the history of wine tourism of the Western Cape and how wine estates were presenting their history to the public versus what that history actually was.
Okay.
That was quite a while back in the year 2003 or 4.
Right.
And then I had got an opportunity to actually test out what I was studying and work for a wine estate and dig up their history. And it was actually far more interesting and complicated and nuanced and fascinating than what we ever were taught in school history books. And I think being able to bring that out to the surface, place histories, stories of places. But I always say that a sense of place is not just about its buildings, it's about a sense of people, which is what Richard Reeve also says about District 6. So understanding how people's social history shaped places,
right.
and often very much the unacknowledged or marginalized history that, because obviously we have a lot of that in South African history, and trying to bring that to the fore and actually to realize that we actually have a lot in common, more than what separates us very often.
Because I of course had to go stalk you over the past week and find out more about you. So you've got blogs and you writing a lot. I also saw you were involved in Franschhoek, and you also involved a lot at the District 6 part of the history. Tell me a bit about Franschhoek and District 6.
So Franschhoek, I spent lots of different projects kind of looking at, and Franschhoek used to be called Olifantshoek.
Okay.
Was one of its original names, and it was because of the Olifantspad that used to pass through and over the mountains, which of course was made by the feet of elephants.
Wow.
And the last elephant was actually seen in Franschhoek in around the 1860s. And, we're talking about a totally different landscape. You don't go to Franschhoek now. It's very curated, and it's these white gables and wine estates, which of course is part of its character. But imagining the landscape when there were rhino and hippo in the river, in the Berg River, and elephant creating the paths. I mean, it's just, and of course the indigenous people who were living there. And that's what our roads are based on. It's all of our roads in the Cape are very often based on elephants' tracks. So that was really Franschhoek, kind of looking at, and I redid the Huguenot Museum in Franschhoek, to kind of take the Huguenot story and how do you make it relevant in the present day. And that was through the lens really of exile, persecution, immigration, senses of belonging, not belonging. It's kind of a wider human story. So that was Franschhoek, and then District 6 kind of looking at the social history of the corner shops, the streets, and what happens in the life of streets, which is very public, rather than just what happens in homes, because the homes in District 6 were quite small. So a lot of living took place on the streets. And how do you represent that character of the streets and the games that were played, and knowing the knowledge of where the best samosas were made and on Thursday, and like it's I always like to say that it's also a history of the senses, because people are led by the smells on certain days of the weeks. People were making fish on Fridays or whatever the cycle of the week was, you know, and that's more to acknowledge than what a building looks like. And of course, forced removals took away a lot of those sensory experiences, and that's kind of like the level of loss. It's not just the built form, it's what happened. And I think that this is where also Paarl comes in, because obviously with massive sections of Paarl forcibly removed, the senses of loss are so multiple. You know, childhood is experienced through the senses, and certain smells take you straight back to being in an auntie's kitchen or street corner. So how do you quantify that loss and acknowledge it, you know?
So does your research date back to further than just the Group Areas Act forced removal, or so how far are we going back?
I always like to start with, in some ways, geology of a place. Before we even get to human history, because geology and the way the mountains are shaped and where the rivers are almost tells you the pre-story to why humans settled there. So long-term human occupation of the landscape is always a starting point, but it is linked to geology. And unfortunately in South Africa it is also a topography of erasure, because where you have lived in relation to rivers and mountains and the best soil is also about where people are removed from. So even now, people who have access to water sources and the best soil tend to be the wealthiest. And that is perpetuated over 350 years. So yeah, human history, indigenous history, I never like to start anything in the middle of the 20th century.
Of course, it's a totally different story. Okay, so if we bring it back home, so we of course are in Paarl, and I mean our community that follows are in Paarl. I also, after the research I did this week, I saw you did a lot of work in Paarl as well. Tell us about, maybe just tell us a brief experience about the history of Paarl. I saw you also had what you call a topography of Paarl, and in one of the studies you did, so maybe just tell us a bit about that.
I mean Paarl I think is a fascinating town from what people experience just on the surface level or outside, a bit like Franschhoek as well, a bit like Stellenbosch even. You know, what you see are these kind of this 4 kilometers of Main Street, which is the the longest. 10 kilometers. Oh my gosh.
10 kilometers.
But it is the third oldest town, obviously. But understanding how very much like Stellenbosch and Cape Town, it gets allocated as land grants that are given out by the VOC. But it's kind of like, Coca-Cola handing out land. They don't really have a right to do so, and they're really stepping on indigenous grazing ground. So that, and then, like you dip in and out of things according to projects. So I hadn't spent a huge amount of time other than looking at some of these early land grants. But my interest has always been on slavery, forced removals, and kind of understanding some of those patterns in places, and happened to have done a project related to forced removals in Paarl, and looking at the documentation in the archives, and actually finding this endless documentation about how Group Areas was declared in Paarl and how people were removed, and every single time it's bone chilling and hair raising. You don't get, I find you never get used to reading these things. Seeing a list of the elderly who were petitioning that they should remain because they were in their 70s and 80s and had spent their entire lives, and just watching the apartheid government ramrod their individual names, it hurts on every name level, I would say.
It reaches that point where you can't really think it happened.
Now you walk into the town now and it's just effaced from 100%. There's no I don't think the level of pain that's sitting in the archives and all of these files 100%. Does it, like you walk down the street and it's boutique shops and curated meal experiences and which is great for tourism, but so many people in Paarl are not just a name in the archive. This is part of their lived experience through generations.
And I mean, my experience as well is, that's why I went down this rabbit hole of history, is because I have family that was forced removed. So you speak to you have the conversations, but you don't really grasp it because you just think, okay, that's how it was, and you didn't have a choice. But once you start digging, and like you say, you go way back and you find out all these stories, and that story has a story that you, I mean, after chatting to you that has a very good knowledge of the history of Paarl, I feel I just scraped the surface, because once I saw some of the information you have, it's like, I didn't even know this existed. But it also gave me a light bulb that when searching it, the information isn't all there readily available. And that's why on the Village Guide I just decided to start telling these stories, because there are generations that don't know so much of the history, and the new generation is on social media. So use it as a informative education platform, so they could also start asking parents and grandparents, did you see this photo of X?
Yeah, I mean, the Gribble Collection, as you mentioned in the beginning, is this incredible resource that's been sitting in Paarl for, I mean, they first opened in the 1880s as a photographic studio. So it's been a good old while, and it represents over 100 years of images of people in Paarl, mostly around, I mean, the images that are from 1880s and 1890s. I mean, that is almost crazy to think about, you know, to be able to go back and visually represent people and places. And a lot of them are buildings, it's spaces, some out, I mean, even Paarl Mountain. A lot of people have used the archive to look at built environment history, so it's kind of looking at how buildings have changed through time, and a lot of family history, but I don't think it's ever been used for its full capacity or what its real true value is.
Yeah, because I would understand if there's 20,000 photos of something, it really is going to take a team to sift through it all, but it's not like you have someone's name and surname and you know exactly where it's going. But I mean, for the people that don't know, why is it called the Gribble Collection?
So it was a photographer, John Gribble, and he set up a photographic studio. I think he came from the UK.
What year will we?
Well, about 1886 or 84. I'm not really good with that good with exact dates, but he basically set up in between Main Street and Reservoir, and then actually ended up with 3 studios, one on Market Square, another one by Pastorie-Laan. What was Pastorie-Laan? And I think what's really interesting about the collection is that it is so diverse about who the people of Paarl were at 100%. That time. And the photography of people in their family units, in their marriage portraits, in their sports clubs, in their dramatic societies, their tennis club, whatever the thing is, it has so much detail about, in some ways, who they were, the beauty of like being able to see their faces, look into their eyes, the detail of their clothing, the detail of the book that they've chosen to hold. And in some cases we do have names attached to the photographs and a date and a place, but that's all we have. So it's kind of like a first clue into someone's story. And I've been sitting there I mean, the whole collection is 26,000 glass plate negatives, but you just wonder how many people's lives and stories haven't been told. And for that, we cannot rely on an archive.
100%.
It actually, the knowledge sits in people in the present day. So the only way to activate that collection is through people engaging with it and adding their stories or knowledge. How did you get hold of the photos? I was involved in it. So the collection doesn't belong to me, and I'm not even its curator. But I spent a lot of time with it in 2007, 2008, when the collection was digitized. And realized that this is a magical, special collection. This is a social history of people who have not been represented in Paarl's main history. It is not seen in the main streets. It is not about the town mayor. It is about the ordinary people who built Paarl, and they have not been recognized in a formal way. And so I think the potential is so huge. For, you know, just family history as well, just you know, having, and there is so much identity, dignity in these photographs. It really is, you know, you can just feel that there's, you know, and also the pride about people having their families, having a portrait of their families in it.
I mean, when Michelle and I mean, we saw it for the first time on your laptop, and I mean, there were so many things that popped up. One of it was just the quality of the photos. I mean, you were saying 1800s. It's fascinating. Just the diversity and the different cultural photos, people in Islam clothes, people in sport, cricket, and just like the family are well dressed everywhere. And you think of it like you're thinking 1800s, early 19, well dressed,
Victorian, like full Victorian.
The Islam with their clothes on.
Returned from Mecca. There was some of the images of two women returned from Mecca in Paarl, unfortunately unnamed.
Yeah.
And that's also the difficulty with history when you sit with, and I also struggle with the term unknown or unnamed, because they were known to themselves, and their name was once known. It happens to be lost from a formal collection. It doesn't mean that knowledge is not retrievable. Each of those photographs is like an archive in itself.
Right.
And so the potential to take each image outside of itself and add the depth is really huge.
So I mean, why would you think that the collection is not grasped with both hands and put out there? Like, why is it, if it's part of history, why is it like just lying there?
I think archives in history are potentially not the most exciting thing always to everyone, potentially, maybe. Also having responsibility to look after a collection. I don't think it's full, like I said, I don't think it's been acknowledged in what it really offers, the full spectrum of Paarl history. I think it has been quite narrowly used potentially in the past, and to be able to represent the absolute diversity of Paarl's history, that's its actual potential, and like I said, all the human stories that relate around it. But it is, it's one of those things that I think needs more and more attention and deserves the spotlight, which actually in the end puts the spotlight on people, rather than just places or things or these photographs are probably sitting in family albums and family walls, but in terms of acknowledging who Paarl is, it's only been kept within households, a bit like the information about what people have experienced in terms of group areas, because the one thing that apartheid was really good at was silencing, and that's even apparent in the official kind of government archives, is what remains about who was removed, how they were removed, and obviously massive swathes of documentation have been destroyed. But what remains is, the government kind of saying we're using the river, the Berg River, as a dividing line. So when I would talk about topographies of erasure, is that the actual river is used as a racial classification tool, and that is not just Paarl. I mean, that it could be a mountain, it could be. That does happen, but so I think being able to reconnect to the knowledge that people have, and the stories that people have, the photographs are there in people's albums and on the wall.
But why do you think District 6 is doing it so well?
I think District 6 has been particularly good at having a kind of organized voice against, they were forcibly removed, and then it was because of them they stood up in the 1980s that nothing was built on that land.
Right.
Because in some ways it would be a totally different story if the whole of District 6 is totally populated now.
Okay.
And it had been built over. But they were quite, their resistance was, every place resisted, every single town. But it also depends in terms of actual planning what was then put over it, because obviously a lot of the silencing was compounded by buildings then being put on empty land. And they started their, I suppose, restitution process much earlier than a lot of other places. They've also had a lot of media attention. They've had a lot of kind of legal focus than most small towns, because mostly, if you think about the history of forced removals, District 6 does take up a massive part of the story. Acknowledging places like Claremont, Newlands, small towns that have gone through this, and they haven't been given the same platform, or maybe haven't made it or taken it. And then of course they were very early on with making exhibition about that process, and I think having that holding place a gathering space about their own history curated by themselves.
You're right.
Is quite a big thing.
But is this like? Yeah, for me, it's like, how are they amplifying it? Is it funding that they private? Because of course you need to run a museum.
I mean, it's always funding.
Yeah,
I mean, and then it's always precarious because I think longevity and sustainability in a cultural type of, because they are a cultural force to be reckoned with as well. But I think that their cornerstone and their backbone is their community that drives it. So it's really sitting. It's like one of those powerful examples of how community makes their builds the museum and the story.
Right.
And then of course funding is always difficult, but they have managed to capture it. And I think I mean, perhaps that's even someone to work with at some stage.
But I mean, that's what I'm asking, because if you could blueprint it and do a same type of let's call it initiative in Paarl with their history. I mean, that's we probably have to follow them because they doing it right.
And in some ways, Peniel also with the way they worked with, I think that was Stellenbosch University as well, on their kind of little museum on the mission station and their stories and family histories. So there are definitely examples, but I mean, funding for exhibitions and all of that kind of thing. I mean, this is really essentially what our cultural history of our landscape should look like. It should look like I recognize myself in the history of a town
100%.
that's being produced.
Right.
Or, like you shouldn't be walking in there and say, I don't see any part of myself or my family in this place.
Right.
It's not represented.
Yeah, because I think you become a voiceless person when this disappears. And your generation or your great-grandmother, great-great-mother, they experienced it. So you as a youngster must, of course, know, I don't want to say the pain, but you must know the story behind it.
I mean, of course, a lot of people from the older generation don't want to talk about it. It's 100%. What we often find, because the pain is so visceral, and trying to focus beyond it when it's already been the most catastrophic thing. I mean, like we're talking about losing aunties and uncles and having your world separated out from childhood and onwards. It's just
Because I mean, have you ever experienced? Of course, you're busy in Franschhoek and you're busy in districts. Have you ever experienced this cautiousness to embark on an initiative like this, or any resistance to embark on a project?
I think that there's always a bit of that in everything. I think there's been a lot. I mean, we're talking how many years into democracy, which is not the rose-tinted glasses that we had in 1994. I mean, the promises, when we first interviewed farming communities in kind of the early 2000s, I think everyone was still very much, that the hopes were so huge. And I think going through the processes now and realizing the economies haven't changed as much, the stories haven't always made it out as much, the history hasn't really rebalanced. In fact, we're still actually being held at the face of the history we've just experienced. So the only thing I can say is that people have the most incredible time, and the gift is when they give their time and their stories, and that is something that isn't just about a particular project. It will last forever. Deciding whether you want to be involved and just share a story has the power beyond. I think it goes beyond, because that information will remain and change something somewhere along the line. How people see a place.
So what are we going to do with the Gribble Collection?
So I would just love to see that it is used more, but also I think we need to have some of these images out there and people being able to add their stories to it, whether it's both physical or virtual. And that people actually, I think that they could just be catalysts, these images, for talking about a past. But there's no point in talking about a past unless it relates to the present.
100%.
So drawing that line between past and present, and what these histories mean to people, where they are now, visions for the future. Sometimes having a vision for the future is actually based on knowing your past
100%.
and acknowledging it. So you know, what do people want from Paarl today and tomorrow? I think that looking at who the people were in Paarl in the past is actually part of that.
Yeah, but if you experience, has there been towns that have embarked on this type of project or initiative, and what did they do to connect people to history?
What works quite well is always mapping. So looking at old maps of places or people, actually building a map, whether it's virtual or physical, and adding making it site specific, adding the places where they used to live along with any images and the stories. And so in some way you end up creating a new topography. You change the history by creating it, because I mean, in some ways, a map is a political act. It creates the space. So if we need to change how Paarl looks, we need to change the map and create a new map. So, you know, even just plotting where people lived and adding stories, it is possible to change how we even look at Paarl in the present day, I think. So yeah, people have done that sometimes virtually and digitally. District 6 does that. They did that in Riebeek Kasteel. And Riebeek Kasteel is almost exactly the same kind of story. You know, a main road is decided, or a certain road becomes the barrier between who lives where, or a canal. I mean, it's always this kind of physical manifestation. And then it's very much the same archives. I mean, it was fascinating to me that a whole burial ground was shifted and moved and then forgotten about whoever lived there.
In Paarl?
That was in Riebeek Kasteel. And in that case, that means that apartheid even wanted you to forget your deceased. And they, you know, so the levels of it are, and that's not an uncommon story if you think of Prestwich Place. And you know, generally one of the inheritances of being kind of forced to be removed or forgotten is always that so are your dead. Also then, you know, so the honoring of the past and recognizing even something as simple as burial grounds or graves.
So I mean, like, for someone with so much passion and enthusiasm for history, and of course previous or cultural beliefs, if Tinkerbell came with this magic wand, how would you picture this Paarl connecting the people to the history?
Oh, Tinkerbell. I would love to see, obviously, a town exhibition, a town museum. I think that a center holding place that's not just about representing the history, but a gathering place for the present. You know, it's about, can you sit there and have meetings in this space? Can the young people gather and connect to the internet surrounded by stories? Can they add their own voices? Can they do, I mean, the young people have all the technology and they know how to work their phones better than anyone. So I think the possibilities for, you know, it doesn't have to be just about the past, it can be about the present. I would just like, whether it's meeting in workrooms mixed with spaces that continually build exhibitions, and, you know, in some ways, to be sustainable, you have to think not just about the past. You got to think about businesses and, you know, how do people use space? I mean, even the room we're sitting in is kind of built on that kind of. And I think the future is almost about shared spaces, different meeting points, you know. So yeah, that would be a dream.
So what's keeping you busy in 2024? What is your project?
24, it's more social history of public spaces, different sites, hopefully working more on Paarl and the collection, ideally. I would love to see a physical exhibition outside, inside. I think putting markers about the history in situ, in place, is also critical. It's not just about having a virtual representation. It should manifest itself within the streets of Paarl. People should be able to walk down Paarl and see images about who the people were, and recognize that even walking past, there's something that transforms that space just by that act alone. You know, it's kind of like an act of restitution to put the people back in the spaces, even if it's just visually.
Yes, I mean, we chatted earlier also, so journalist writing for Holland newspaper. Why is there, what's the keen interest or focus on Paarl history?
I think that it's because the power of it to tell so many diverse stories that go beyond itself. It is a microcosm for what happened in South Africa. But at the same time, its character is so unique. It is still a story about the individual people. So it's got all the great makings of telling a bigger story, while at the same time having its unique town history and people who are at the helm that have characterized. And family histories that made the town and built the town are actually important. I mean, so yeah.
I mean, I'm already thinking, if I think about one, I can see like a series of this type of conversation. Chatting to people that experienced it, because there's so many, like really good production of storytelling, plus photos, images, high resolution images. I mean,
and also just adding the layers to an image. You know, some of it might be young people questioning an image. It might be older people being able to add stories to an image. It might be new people saying, 100%. I knew nothing of this history. Maybe someone is angry with the image. You know, I don't know. You don't know the potential for even just one image. But I think that I don't think we even understand the tip of what is possible between what these images are going to be able to do and what people's stories are going to be able to add. I think that, and you know what, sometimes the history of a place or a town is about just having a diversity of individual stories. It's not about adding one storyline, it's adding multiple. I think that's what we need to see, is that it's multiple people's lived experiences and stories of a place that actually do make the place.
Yeah, and I think stories like that could ignite a junior researcher to say, I'm going to do my thesis on Paarl history, and of course they'll dig up even more stuff, because and if you have 5 or 6 of them every year digging up new things, can you imagine, like you're saying, it's the amount of the opportunity it presents is crazy.
Totally.
Tracey, thanks so much.
Thank you. It's been wonderful.
Hopefully we get to chat a lot more in 2024.
Yes, hopefully not just Tinkerbell.
No, not Tinkerbell. So yeah, 2024 I'm going to have to be knocking on a lot of doors, because I think this is going to be a super, I don't even think it's like a cool project. I just think it's a valuable project. It adds value to the community.
I also think that even for anyone who isn't part of that community, to be able to look into someone's face and see parts of themselves, parts of a history that they might be able to relate to, whether it's as mother, daughter, child, son, 100%. Uncle, aunt, that's what's in there. Sporting hopes. You know, we sit with a generation of youth who idolize our sporting heroes because they are doing the most amazing things, when actually Paarl has potentially the most iconic legacy of sporting people who in the 1880s and 1890s were really stepping ahead in terms of sport and making sporting teams. So the potential for that past and present interface with young people who idolize sport, and yet recognizing that where its beginnings are, what that looks like. So yeah, lots of different possibilities.
It's like I just we're scraping the surface here. But madam, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Yes.